All right. As we continue our discussion about the great Thin Lizzy song Jailbreak, I now bring in my very good friend. Let me see if I can get, I'm sure I'll forget some stuff, but comedian, um, television star, comedy writer, and podcast host on this very network, Pantheon, the great Mr. Don Jamieson. Don, sir, how are you?
Hey, good. I think you got it all in there, and I appreciate that. And I'm excited to talk about our favorite band, or at least one of them that's extremely high up on our list and means a lot to us. So this will be fun.
Yeah, and obviously there's, Thin Lizzy to me is one of the most influential bands of all time. And, you can talk to any metal band, whether it's a death metal band or a pop metal band, and they all love Thin Lizzy. There's so much love for that, and especially for Phil as a songwriter. And it's, I'm going to get to, I'm sure, a few of these songs as we go through these 100 episodes here. But the first one, I really wanted you to come in because you're a really great fan of Thin Lizzy. You've spent a lot of time in Ireland. You spent time with Phil's mom, which is amazing. And, you've been out with Black Star Riders and Scott Gorham. So you've got a really great opinion and insight into Thin Lizzy. So here we are talking about Jailbreak.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned death metal bands being influenced by Thin Lizzy. And for people watching or listening now, they're going, wait a minute, now they're getting out of hand. But it is true because one of your own fantastic death metal bands, 6 Feet Under, did a cover of the song we're talking about today, Jailbreak. So it's not as far-fetched as people think. They really do still have such a great reach. And I'm still turning people on to Thin Lizzy to this day, which tells you a lot about how much this music holds up.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting because we did a podcast together years ago with the late great legendary Bob Nalbandian, what was myself, you, and Scott Gorham, and we were talking about just the overall vibe of Thin Lizzy and how influential they were. And I mentioned to Scott that there's not one single metal band that I've ever worked with or metal band that I've ever known that weren't big fans of Thin Lizzy and weren't heavily influenced, like even the really heavy stuff. He's like shocked, like, really, are you serious? I'm like, you don't know that? Like, it's so insane about how influential they were. And they might be, in, it's debatable, of course, but obviously Black Sabbath is probably the originators and maybe the most influential, but Thin Lizzy is definitely way up there because you can talk about all these other bands, but there's always detractors for different, Metallica obviously, but they have detractors for some bizarre reason, but Thin Lizzy really just doesn't.
Yeah, unfortunately, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but unfortunately in America, most people only know Jailbreak and The Boys Are Back in Town, but around the world, they had, many, many hits. And even while Jailbreak is a phenomenal song, it's just one of many phenomenal songs in their catalog. And you're right about Gorham. It took him a really long time, and he told me this directly, to realize, oh man, I guess Thin Lizzy really was influential and people still do care about it. And he started putting together his summer tours, his Thin Lizzy band, which, would be different people each time, because he's like, yeah, now I really realized it's important to keep the name out there and the music alive. And of course, playing with Black Star Riders, I did 2 tours with them. And of course, Jailbreak always on the set list.
Yeah, and we can sit here and talk, for probably an hour and a half about, various people that we know that love Thin Lizzy. But just to make my point, so last night I was at a hockey game with my good friend Mr. Nick Stewart from Power Trip, and we just he started talking about Thin Lizzy, and we started talking about how this love for Thin Lizzy. But he came in, he's younger, so he came in later. Like, he came in basically on Cold Sweat and where he was talking about the Live Life album, like that's his favorite Thin Lizzy album, and he likes it even more than Live and Dangerous, which of course is the quintessential one, but it's because that's when he came in and he loved all those songs. It's a bit of a heavier record because it came from Thunder and Lightning and and all that stuff and Renegade. So So that was just and just yet another just another example of a major influence by this amazing band, who's by the way having a nice renaissance, which is good for them.
Yeah, and it's funny because this podcast has the word metal in it, right?
Yes,
And
100
so
songs that define heavy metal.
yeah, and so when you're thinking about heavy metal, maybe Thin Lizzy's not a name that pops up automatically, but you really there's songs that are much heavier than this in their catalog. I mean, I'm assuming part of the process is picking a song that had really that had popularity as well as heaviness. Of course, it epitomizes the dual guitar attack as well, and all those things. But this could have been Angel of Death. It could have been Thunder and Lightning. It could have even been Emerald. And maybe those songs will make the list. I don't know, but I'm just saying, like in terms of heaviness, if you don't think Lizzy's heavy metal, listen to the catalog, and especially the Sykes era, which is really just the one album, but they were going in that direction.
Yeah, and part of this is my list pretty much. So, well, not pretty much, it is my list. So, but what I'm trying to do with the podcast is really educate people on where heavy metal came from, what were the origins of heavy metal, like what were the bands that caused all of the great bands out there to be who they are, and how the genre is living more healthily than it's been a long time. Here we are in 2024, 25. So the education process to that is really important to me because, of course, I love all these bands, and these bands were a massive influence on me. So I think it's important to kind of talk about that. And Thin Lizzy really is just, as I mentioned earlier, just one of the quintessential bands that had so much to do with metal. And if it wasn't for Thin Lizzy, it's not that it wouldn't exist, but I think that so much of what they did, the dueling guitars and the songwriting and everything, just really has a massive influence. I mean, Metallica, like you talk to their top three bands, like Thin Lizzy's in the top three bands. In fact, they have the original Thin Lizzy logo in their rehearsal studio, which kind of makes me mad, but happy at the same time. It's like, I want that.
Absolutely. And yeah, they have that one?
No, it's the famous one where the lights all go around
The
it.
logo one, right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's just like I think that's just like a video screen or something. But let's talk about the Jailbreaks and get down to the song, because we've been talking about it the whole episode here. And again, you have to go back to 1975, right? And in 1975, at least to me as a young kid, this song was super heavy. Like those riffs and that guitar tone was so heavy. I was like, this is just incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Just that the hitting of the opening chord is so powerful. Just that one thing, and when people hear that, they go crazy. So I agree. At the time, yes, this is super heavy for that time period.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important. You look at a lot of bands, like we've talked about Alice Cooper in the first round of shows, and people wouldn't say, "Well, he's not really heavy metal," but it's like, but that if you go back to what Cooper was doing in the early '70s, I mean, that stuff. I mean, there's stuff, and I'll get to some of these songs, I'm sure, as we go through all these episodes. But there's stuff like "Halo of Flies" that, like, it's almost as heavy as Black Sabbath. I mean, there's some heavy riffs there, and this is another example of just how a really heavy song that also turned out to be a pretty big radio hit too, not only in the U.S. but massively around the world.
Yeah, and they also benefited a lot from finally a really well-produced album, because some of the previous ones, while they were produced okay, in fact, the first couple, I mean, with the band we came to know, not the Eric Bell years, but even the first couple of when they became a four-piece, very, very spotty production, a lot like Kiss. Those first three Kiss albums are produced terribly, and it really took the live album for you to get into them. So, here's everything lining up for a band that, admittedly would shoot themselves in the foot around every corner. Anytime they would have a little success, they would find a way to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, or snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. But with this album, they got it right all around. But the production was really solid on this.
Yeah, and it's like this is another thing that I love about Thin Lizzy. And there's a lot of really these bands that came out in the 70s that and we just don't see that as much anymore. Is, it took them a long time. You mentioned Kiss. It took them 4 albums to become big. And Thin Lizzy was even longer than that. I think this is their kind of big coming out record. And this, I think, was record 5. And, reading books, Scott Borum's book, which is great, and, books about Thin Lizzy. And, they were kind of like similar to Rush and so many of these different bands. They put out a few records, not much was happening. They didn't have a lot of budgets to make it sound really good, which is another reason why the production wasn't great on the earlier records. But here is kind of the, okay, make it or break it album. And they obviously made it and became, legends.
Yeah, absolutely. And the strength of the opening song really dictates the whole album, and it certainly does. On this one, and of course, it's the album title, so it better be damn good.
And I think the lyrical content is really great. Obviously, Phil, again, one of the best songwriters of all time. And again, you go back to the 70s, and this is why I try to preach context a lot on this podcast, is because this stuff like this, these sort of titles and subject matter of, Jailbreak, or we can break it out of the jail. Back in the 70s, people were like, oh my God, these people are crazy. And they're talking about prisons and people break, all this crazy stuff that would scare people in the 1970s. And that's why, again, another reason why this stuff was so cutting edge and was so influential by what's happening with metal since back then.
Yeah, it's with Phil, talking about him as a songwriter. My God, this is such a quintessential Phil lyric. He would always write about himself and the dichotomies of him. And Jailbreak's a perfect example of that, where, Phil would either write songs where he was the hero or he was the villain. Well, in this one, he's the villain, right? Me and the boys, we don't like it, so we're busting out and getting down. So Phil in this one is the tough guy. And that was the other thing. Phil was, he liked to write about being the tough guy, right? So this song, The Boys Are Back in Town, The Rocker, but he also wrote songs about being sort of the broken little boy. He was, obviously, man, his lyrics were so beyond introspective. He really tapped into all the different sides of himself. So for every song about being a tough guy, there was a song about this sort of lonely, vulnerable boy, or the lonely guy at the bar, like in Borderline, and trying to figure out his life. And then there would be the tough guy songs. And, this is him in the villain role. And I think you're right. I think that was really appealing, especially at that time, to people to hear about a song about a jailbreak. And I don't think anybody had ever really written anything like that before.
AC/DC probably right before that Jailbreak, but that was early on. But the thing about Phil too, he's just so brutally honest. Like, you're talking about, the different aspects of him as a songwriter. Look at Got to Give It Up. He knew he had a problem. He knew he had a drug and alcohol problem. He's very, talked about it a lot in some of these records coming after this, like Johnny the Fox and Bad Reputation, which, another tough guy album. But Got to Give It Up, he's like talking about, I gotta give this up. I have to. I have a problem in it, and I can't. And it's really a shame that, all the stuff that exists now, people getting help for, addiction and all these things, certainly didn't exist back then, and it unfortunately cost him his life.
Yeah. That was really the other side of Phil. Like I said, and he could tap into that. So on one side, he could be the tough guy. On the other side, or the romantic. That was the other, dichotomy with Phil, was he would be the romantic, but then he'd also be the guy who was brokenhearted and, couldn't really find true love. And, Gotta Give It Up is a good example of him showing his vulnerable side. And really, like, he apologizes basically to his mother in that song.
Yep.
And for as tough a guy as Phil was, and, having spoke to Scott and people who have known him over the years, Glenn Hughes, like he was a tough guy, but he was also the guy who was real vulnerable as well. And he always showed that in his songwriting. And I always really respected that about him. I think we watched one of your Thin Lizzy bootlegs one night, and it was a great show. I think it's from Dublin, and he curses while he's introducing one of the next song, and his mom's up in the balcony. He looks up and he goes, "Oh, sorry, mom. I didn't mean to curse." So that was Phil in a nutshell. The tough guy, but he didn't want to curse in front of his mother.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously raised by his mom and a huge mama's boy. But so you bring up his mom, Philomena, and I got to spend a little bit of time with her, and she was just wonderful and friendly, and all of the things that you would hope she would be. But you got to spend quite a bit of time with her, even going to the house and everything. So what was that experience like?
Well, I think it showed where Phil's personality came from in a lot of ways. Obviously, we don't need to go through the whole history of Philomena's life, but although I highly recommend people reading her autobiography, which is called My Boy. In the late 40s, to a white single woman to be pregnant with a black baby, and had people begging her to give it up for adoption, and she had to go to England so she could actually have a place to live, because nobody wanted to let her a room, because she was going to give birth to a black baby, and to say, no, I'm keeping this baby. And it turns out to be one of the biggest rock stars in the world. Shows her toughness, and that's where Phil got it from. But also her vulnerable side as well, which was really that journey that she went through as this young single mother going through life, with this young child, and he becomes what he becomes. But she's sort of the same way. And looking through photos of Phil, in her photo book, and she'd say, oh, I love this photo of me, boy. And she'd go, oh, I don't like that one because I can see the drugs in his eyes. And, she was just very open and honest. And probably the greatest gift that she ever gave me was Phil put a lot of his lyrics into poetry books. He did 2 of them back in the 70s. And she actually gave me an original copy of one of them. And, I'm not a religious guy, but that's as close to a Bible as it gets.
Yeah, that's pretty spectacular. So one thing we got to talk about that we haven't gotten to yet that also goes with the massive influence of this band is the guitars. And they were really one of the first bands. I know people argue Wishbone Ash. Yeah, okay, I agree. But they're really one of the first bands to really do this dueling guitar thing. And first of all, both phenomenal guitar players, Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham. The leads are incredible on this song, and all the harmony guitars. Like nobody was doing that back then. If you look at Sabbath and Purple and Zeppelin, it's just all one guitar player bands and doing their thing, and that's kind of the way it was. And this was really one of the first heavier bands to really have 2 guitar players. And then you combine that with all these harmonies and melodies, it's pretty insane.
Yeah, and again, Jailbreak is such a perfect song to illustrate that point, because it became their signature, which, with a band like Judas Priest that always had 2 guitar players, but Thin Lizzy was born out of a 3-piece. So for that to become somehow that Phil knew that he needed that double guitar attack, and to find to find Brian Robertson and then bring this guy over from America to lock in with him that had a totally different style, but yet obviously they complemented each other. But the most important thing was for them to play together, and that became their signature sound, which of course, Priest, Maiden, so many bands, said, hey, that sounds pretty good. Maybe we'll try that too.
Yeah, and those bands, of course, we talk about the newer current bands and being so influenced by Thin Lizzy, but yeah, I mean, both Priest and Maiden, all of really any band in the new wave of British heavy metal, and prior to that, the two guitar thing pretty much came from Thin Lizzy, because again, up until then, like nobody's even Thin Lizzy wasn't doing it in the early days. It was just them and Eric Bell. But once they added the two guitar players, changed the sound, changed the dynamic, and really kind of changed the course. In my opinion, kind of changed the course of heavy music.
Yeah, and the other thing to point out about this song, I think you can find it on YouTube. I suspect that's where I found it, going down a Thin Lizzy rabbit hole for several hours one night. Was the um, isolated bass tracks, and to hear, we all think of Phil as, obviously one of the smoothest voices in rock and roll, but his bass playing was so great, and that he did it, obviously did them together live, and really, never missed a beat. And the other part of that equation being, Phil died in 1986, so there's no live recordings of him past there, obviously. So anything that's on the internet was recorded with really old recording devices, not like the stuff we have now. I mean, now your iPhone, you could shoot a feature film on your iPhone. The quality is so good. But I defy anybody to go down a rabbit hole and find any bad recordings of Phil. I mean, even when his voice might have been a little rough one night, it was still better than 99% of people. So, he's sort of, it's like the Glenn Hughes thing. Like, you almost forget that he's playing bass because his voice was so good.
Yeah, and that's the other aspect of Thin Lizzy too, is just how all four of those guys were phenomenal musicians. Like, to me, Brian Downey, the drummer, is one of the best rock and metal drummers I've ever heard. Like, some of the stuff he's doing is crazy. Like, you're like, how is this happening in these songs? Like, very much, it reminds me a lot of Bill Ward, because Bill Ward did a lot of like all those rolls and all that sort of stuff in the early days that, a lot of drummers weren't really doing that. If you listen to, I mean, Ian Pace in Deep Purple, sure, but Bonham and a lot of these other guys were just kind of grooving, the grooving things, and these were more almost kind of progressive drum rolls and stuff. And of course, Phil fit in perfectly playing bass, and you're right, he gets so much credit for being a great songwriter and lyricist and singer. You forget he was a really good bass player too.
Yeah, I think with Brian, not on Jailbreak, not on the song Jailbreak, but obviously on the song The Boys Are Back in Town. Without that swing, that song would, I don't believe it would have been a hit. I mean, I really, the drums in that song, it's sort of like I Want You to Want Me by Cheap Trick. Without that, if it was just a sort of a straight ahead beat, it just wouldn't have the same feel to it. And then obviously Phil is locking in with what Brian's doing. So yeah, I agree, man. I think that's such a huge, those four people were meant to play with each other. And then we got to give Scott huge kudos. After Brian Robertson left, he had to play with a handful of other people, and it still worked, whether it was Gary Moore or Snowy White or John Sykes. But at least they always stuck with the dual guitar sound, because once that's your signature, that's it forever.
Yeah, and also this song Jailbreak was another important thing for Thin Lizzy, because I've talked to so many, especially younger people, like people under 35 or so, let's say, who Boys Are Back in Town. Obviously, everybody knows that song, but it's kind of like, whatever. But this song is a pretty big hit too, and this was the one that was kind of got them down the rabbit hole of like, oh, this is a little bit heavier and kind of interesting. And then they go back and start listening to the other catalog, and then they get hooked. I've heard that countless times of people that heard this song on the radio or on TV or in a commercial or whatever it was, and it's like, oh, that's, I kind of knew who Thin Lizzy were, but I didn't really know them that much. And I heard this, and this was like, oh, this is a lot heavier. And then they go back and backtrack and get into it.
Yeah, and I have the 45 somewhere of the Jailbreak single, and the B-side is Running Back. And I had always heard over the years that the record company really wanted Running Back to be one of the singles, maybe even the lead single. So it was interesting that I think these guys fought for it for Jailbreak, and the boys are back in town to be ahead of it, and now Running Back becomes the B-side of the Jailbreak single, which ended up working out pretty well.
Yeah, there's a million stories like that too, where the record company goes, "Oh, we want this," and it's like, nah, that's not gonna work.
Yeah, you've
So.
probably done that a few times to bands.
I'm usually on the other end. I'm usually the one arguing for a song that I think is really good, and the band's like, eh. Like, real quick, famous side story about that was I get the album Twilight of the Thunder God by Amon Amarth, and that song is like eighth on the sequence, that's kind of the last part before the ending. That's kind of the throwaway songs. And I go, guys, this is like the best song you've ever done. Like, why is this so far in the sequence? Well, we don't really know. We don't really think it's that great a song. I mean, you're crazy. So I basically convinced them. They put it the first song on that album. It's now become their biggest song of all time. So bands are sometimes so close to stuff that they don't quite get it. But I think back in the more radio friendly days, that's when you're like the record company PR guys like, well, this one will be the one. The band's like, nah, it's not really the right one. So.
Yeah, and I think we've always heard over the years about Phil was a very stubborn guy, and he wanted things done his way. Which listen, when your name is on something, you want it to be done the right way. So he was obviously very protective of Thin Lizzy and his band, and I can always appreciate that. Real quick, going back to Philomena, this was another good insight into how Phil really took after her. So the first time I went to Dublin, I called her house, and her nephew answered, and I said, I introduced myself, and I said I'd like to come over to the house, and he said, oh yeah, he said, Philomena, there's a young man from America who wants to come over. He's a big fan of your son, and she goes, okay, tell him to take a cab. So I go, yeah, I'll catch a cab from the hotel. And then I hear in the background go, tell him to tell the cab driver, don't mess him around because he's American. Because if he does, when he drops him off, he'll have to deal with me. So I get in the cab and I tell the driver that, and he turns around and he goes, typical Irish, old school Irish woman, So, Philomena was tough, man. He goes, I know the house. He goes, don't worry, I'll take care of you. He goes, I know Philomena. I brought 1 million people there. So, yeah, she was amazing. And the last couple of years that I knew her, Brian, she obviously she had cancer, and she didn't let anybody know. She just, which was sort of like Phil at the end, right? He didn't want anybody to know he was suffering. Just very, very proud, very strong Irish people. And obviously that was just such a huge influence in the music.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. I mean, just the Irish culture in general was such a big influence in so much of the stuff he wrote. But yeah, amazing stuff, amazing song, amazing Don Jamieson. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Give us all your plugs for all your various stuff you got going on here.
Well, I'll just plug my show that I have here on Pantheon called Rock Strap. That's myself and Keith Roth from Sirius XM. And we do something a little different. We talk to rock stars about sports and sports stars about rock. And I think we're like 13, 14 episodes in. So check us out, Rock Strap. And there's my newest stand-up comedy album on Metal Blade Records, which I am always very proud about. That's the original Motorhead stuff. Maybe you'll have me come back to talk about Motorhead, because obviously they're a huge influence. And all my albums are tributes to my favorite bands. And my first one on Metal Blade was a tribute to Thin Lizzy, Live and Hilarious instead of Live and Dangerous. So pick that up wherever you pick up fine to mediocre comedy.
Well, thanks again. I'm going to invite myself onto your show. I'm not a rock star, but I know my sports, so we can you can reciprocate, hopefully.
You very much do, and I'm going to see you in a couple of weeks. And if there's a game happening in town, let's go. Please partake. I had a great time at the Raiders game. Always fun to go see the Vegas Knights. So.
Sounds like a plan. Well, again, thanks you so much for doing this. Appreciate it. And we'll see all you guys next episode.
All right. That was great. Thank you.